Ray, Doug Howard, CEO of Pondurance. What we'll be talking about today is a series of CISO topics. But first, let's talk about the gap of grief. And so for me, that particular topic is, as you know, I've acted as a CISO, virtual CISO. I've acted as executive supporting the CISO, and really trying to justify to the other business members why we need to make certain investments without turning it into a technical conversation that they would probably get lost in, but also tying it to the business needs in a way that is quantifiable in some aspect that they're willing to get behind. So Dustin, with you.
I'm Dustin Hutchison, Senior Vice President of Services and the CISO at Pondurance. And I think the gap of grief boils down to a gap between the ability to understand and communicate technical issues in a timely manner to maybe a non-technical group of people, either leadership or board, and then coming together to make decisions based on the outcomes or the information available to know what to do next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nilu Howe. I'm the chair at Pondurance. And while I have never been a CISO, I have had the security function report to me, and I serve on a number of both public and private boards in the cybersecurity space, as well as the person who has the cybersecurity expertise. Based on this conversation, I believe I am the gap of grief. And really excited to talk about this conversation and about how the entire conversation around security, cybersecurity architecture should be positioned in a strategic way so that both executives and board members know how to make the right decisions.
Okay, so let's start out. Neil, as a board member, how do you look at this relative to what oversight a board participation really needs to provide guidance and feedback to the teams that are presenting to you?
So that's a great question. And in today's environment, cyber risk is becoming increasingly strategic to every company. The impact bad cyber hygiene has on a company's ability to operate, on a company's reputation, on a company's ability to protect intellectual property, including customer data, is becoming more important and more intense every day. Any company basically has three lines of defense. The first line is the CISO. The second line is typically the audit committee. It's the committee that oversees risk. And the third line of defense is the board. And those three, the interplay of those three depends on what industry you're in, the size of the company, and the resources the company has to put against cyber risk. So as a board member, the most important thing that we can do is make sure that there's a cadence of meetings between the CISO and the board where we can really understand and give a channel to help the CISO and the company effectively manage that level of risk, right? It's the CISO and the CEO and the CIO. And the board serves as a check and balance to make sure that we understand the CISO's perspective, as well as the business unit's perspective, and that the company is making the right trade-offs, both in terms of the risk it's willing to take, as well as how it's apportioning resources to protect the company. The board has a really important voice in setting acceptable risk levels and reviewing what the company believes to be the right risk levels. We also then participate in monitoring and looking over the metrics and the milestones in order to make sure that those risk levels are adhered to. And one of the most important things that I believe boards that are well-functioning do is what we call near-miss exercises. So there's a lot of cyber events that don't actually impact that particular company, but by reviewing what would have happened if that cyber event had impacted the company, helps you understand what you're doing well, where the gaps are, and how to close those gaps.
Awesome. And so, Dustin, we've got the virtual CISOs group, which you constantly are acting as a virtual CISO yourself sometimes, and then obviously CSO of Pondurance. And so when you think about how do you close some of the gap Nilu was just referring to in a way that provides the confidence to both the board and a CISO if they already have a CISO, as well as the audit committees that Nilu was referring to. Because sometimes, even if you have a CISO, they want a third party to come in and give some type of feedback, like, is this right? Is the CISO right? Or just an augment a third party decision as well. But like, what are some of the ways that we help, for example, close that informational gap and that confidence gap?
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting the lines of defense, and we like to coach the CISOs that we work with that they're a liaison with their operational teams, which includes Pondurance also. So one of the things that we do is, help CISOs understand, what's the audience appropriate message to take to those different groups with the right metrics that matter. And the funny thing is, different metrics matter to different people, right? So having them available, knowing how to digest them and present them in a meaningful way is one of the things that we really help with. You take a step past the CISO into the more tactical or the operational. A lot of times they'll have a team where it's, focused on maybe a general IT function, a policy function, or a pure security function. And you look at Pondurance with our managed detection and response as an extension of their team. So how can we arm them not only with that proactive and reactive operational effectiveness, but also the right information that matters at the right time to bubble up? And so a big part of what we do is that liaison or that translator between operational real risk that's not point in time. It happens constantly. It's constantly changing. How are you going to present that to those upper lines of defense that have a say in what you're prioritizing and buying, essentially, and how you're protecting the business? So coaching CISOs, even if a virtual CISO comes in and it's the CISO's right-hand man, they are backed by the power of Pondurance. It's not just a 1-2 punch, it's a one mini punch, right? And so a big part of that puzzle is what matters to that organization, what is the board, audit, other leadership asking about, and how can we make everybody more comfortable and confident from a risk tolerance perspective.
But if I can jump in for a second, has to do with educating the board and the managers about exactly what Dustin was talking about, and having sort of a power of a team behind you that can help you understand how to educate and how to speak the right language and talk about the right issues is critical, because not everyone is trained in cybersecurity best practices, and it's actually not very easy to translate. So what Dustin was talking about is critical.
Yeah, and in that translation, I think that's a key point, because not everybody has a NILU on their board, right? So they may not have in their audit committee or in any of their board construct the ability to understand all the aspects of cybersecurity and the questions asked, even at business level. And I think that the challenge that I see every day is you get people that don't have as much expertise, executives and board members, that they think they can pull a lever and that's going to result in a particular outcome, or they're going to make a certain investment and that's going to have a certain amount of risk reduction. And as we all know, the challenge is the more you do doesn't necessarily mean it won't ever happen, but your risk probably is going down all the time when you do the right things and you make the right investments. But to quantify those is obviously very challenging, because the best I can relate this to as an executive is, just because you invest in sales and marketing doesn't necessarily mean you're going to hit your number. I can guarantee if you don't make certain investments and certain priorities, you're not going to hit your number. But I can't necessarily make sure that if we make certain investments that we will hit the number, or we may blow out the number, right? And I think that is, from a business executive perspective, one of the challenges is, okay, fine, I'll give you this 50,000, 300,000, whatever the dollar amount is, but can you guarantee me that either my risk is going to go down, which is a better question than like nothing will happen? And so, Nilu, do you see any of that, across the marketplace?
Doug, the question you pose is actually a really important one, because what it comes down to is having a real understanding around the table about what your acceptable risk tolerance is. And every company is going to have a different acceptable risk tolerance, especially depending on the industry they're in. A bank, for example, which is in a highly regulated industry, is going to have a very low acceptable residual risk level. Whereas, a company in a non-regulated industry might have a completely different acceptable residual risk level. But it starts with knowing what your risk tolerance is and what the gap is to that risk tolerance. And then what are the actions you're taking to close that gap along the way, understanding there's no nirvana. Like, you're never going to get to perfect because the risk landscape and the threat landscape is constantly evolving. But as long as you're closing that gap and you can show you're closing the gap, then the board is and the board is watching over that, then there's a conversation to have. Now, you're absolutely right that this is not about getting to a place where there are zero incidents. That's not possible. It's getting to a place where there's resilience and that the incidents don't happen in a way that is unexpected, in the sense that you thought you'd close the gap and it turns out that it's wide open. Like, that's a problem. And this is where the near miss exercises that I talked about come in really handy, because when there's an incident, you can absolutely look into it and see what happened and see if it was a risk that you were willing to take or not. The interesting place is when an incident happens to someone else, to go, all right, what was that incident? I mean, we've had a bunch recently, right? Where it may not have necessarily impacted you, but you kind of go through your security architecture and say, all right, if those people had hit, what would have happened to us? And is that okay or is that not okay? So do we need to rethink our risk posture and our resource allocation?
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is the ability to categorize those near misses for our clients. So just because it didn't happen to them, if you've got a board that's asking, like, what would we have done if that happened? It's almost like a mini tabletop exercise. And so again, back to the coaching, we like to take our clients through that journey of understanding business impact analysis from a system standpoint, criticality ratings, and then having categories or buckets of types of incidents, events, or scenarios that they can place these kind of breaking news events into. So they've got that talk track already built in. That takes practice. You've got to understand how each one of these types of things would impact you. So having a client take that, be ready to answer that question for these, nationwide newsworthy stories, and saying, here's what we're doing, or here's what we should be doing to avoid this, I think is a big deal and a great opportunity from a consulting standpoint that Pondurance can provide to clients.
Yeah, and to build on that for a second, Dustin, one of the most important things for board members is to have trust with the security team, right? It's about credibility, it's about reliability, and it's about transparency. And really having those open, transparent, authentic conversations about security and the reality of where we are on that journey. And whether it's an incident or a near miss, having a really open conversation about what that meant is one of the most important things you can do, because that just builds the trust. We know things are going to happen. We know things are going to go wrong. We don't expect, every organization's architecture to be bulletproof. What we do expect is to understand the risks we're taking and the things we're doing to close the gap.
Yeah, and I guess the next question, kind of piggybacking off of what you guys just said, is if you think about the evolution of executives, board members, committee members, et cetera, what you're going to end up with is, as they get more educated, the more questions they're going to ask, which can become time consuming if you don't have a process for proactive notification. You see major events that are happening in the marketplace that you want to proactively, hey, look, we're doing a scenario analysis on this, even though we're not impacted, stuff of that sort. So thoughts about ways to build confidence, whether you're a CISO, whether you're the IT manager without a CISO, whether you're the security guy, in a company, like, what are some of the proactive steps I can take so that I'm not always being pinged by, a higher level with a bunch of questions. Rather, they know I'm going to tell them if they need to think about something, rather than, again, that they feel they need to be asking the questions rather than waiting for me to send some type of information.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done at Pondurance is try to take that holistic look at the type of information that any organization could need. So on the cyber advisory side, we've got My Cyber Scorecard, which is our GRC risk management platform. So it's built on best practice frameworks on purpose, right? You follow best practice for a reason. It also has your regulatory compliance frameworks built in on purpose. Those are things that are a little bit easier for people to understand why you're doing something, but then also having reporting that is less technical, that is bubbled up, that's appropriate for a board or executive level to say, here's how we're doing on these certain things. But then you can also dig in even deeper to the actual technical findings for that audience appropriate on the operational side for the right information for the right people to remediate issues. So having that visibility on the cyber advisory side from a pure governance, risk, and compliance is a huge deal. But then also you think about managed detection and response, where we provide that 24/7 SOC SIM as a service. What we're doing there is really the point in time alert issue tracking, prioritized approach to real time events. And so that's a different type of information for a different type of audience, but then we still aggregate that on a periodic basis so it's meaningful to the right level. And then you bundle that with any of the other service lines that we have, like our vulnerability management program. Some boards care about vulns, right? Some don't, but having that information on a periodic basis and being able to aggregate it together is a competitive advantage that Pondurance offers. So here's the My Cyber Scorecard dashboard. This is our demo site, but this is what it looks like for our clients and for the Pondurance consultants. And this is a completed assessment. This was based off of NIST 800-53. What's important to note is that even though it's been assessed against that framework, it can automatically pivot to these other frameworks for that added visibility. So from a reporting standpoint and visibility standpoint, we like the assess once, report many mindset, but then also having that visibility in case it's necessary. So, and again, this is updatable by the client. So after the assessment's been done and some remediation has taken place, the client or Pondurance consultant can update this so these cyber scores and these risk assessment scores can be updated. So you'll see that it's NIST 800-53, but then you've got the NIST CSF representation here. And so what happens is when we start an assessment, we have a request list and the actual artifacts and evidence that we expect to see are noted here. And then you can have them assigned to the responsible parties. And that's really important from a project management standpoint, especially for any updates that are necessary. So if a score is not necessarily where a client needs it to be, it's tracked here, but then you've got that residual information that can be found here to where everybody sees the historical look, and then also it can be updated. And then what you get also is really robust reporting that is audience appropriate based on the needs. So a lot of organizations will use the spider chart to kind of see where they are based on all the control functions from a CSF standpoint. Then you can get more granular and see that progress over time, which is really the most important part of anything that we do from an assessment standpoint. And then you can have more in-depth risk assessment reporting metrics here also. And again, they all go back to the artifacts, evidence, and report type.
What's really important about what Dustin said, and I'm saying this as someone who's been a user of different GRC products and platforms, because I always had to, approve, whether it was an exception, which I hated approving exceptions, or whatever mitigations we'd taken around a particular incident. My Cyber Scorecard is unique because it can both give the information at a strategic level to the folks who don't need the technical details, and at a technical level to the folks who do need that technical information. And Doug, when you're talking about how do you build that trust with the board so that, or with the management team, so they're asking the right questions, it's all about that education process, right? You need to have a regular cadence of information exchange in a language that your audience understands, where they know what the right questions to ask are. And this is exactly what, a platform like My Cyber Scorecard gives a CISO the ability to be able to do that on a regular basis. It used to be the case that, you can maybe interact with a CISO once a year, especially on a board level. That is not enough today. Not even quarterly is enough. You need to have regular information exchange, understand what's happening, where the risks are, and what steps are being taken. And again, importantly, in a language that the audience, the recipient of that information understands.
Yeah, and Dustin, if you go back to gap of grief, right? At least this is the way I look at it, and you can tell me, something different, is when I think about the gap of grief, the opportunity is to break it down for the business, oriented people into, I'll call it two simple areas, right? Number one is all the way down to the control level, which are foundational. Here are the gaps that exist within your best practices, whether that was an individual control, whether that's a category of controls, whatever that may be. And you were talking about My Cyber Scorecard and how it rates on those types of elements. And then also on the operational threats, right? Like what you saw in MDR, what you saw in vulnerability scanning, what you saw on the front page that is a new thing that just came out that's going to bite, a whole bunch of companies. Like, talk about that a little bit more relative to how do you take and build from the bottoms up rather than just the tops down types of elements. So not only is it improving your interactions with the board, but measurably you can also show them the improvements that are happening at a more minute level as proof points.
Yeah, I think it's easier to go, top down and then bottom up and kind of meet in the middle. And one of the things that we try to do for the more technical resources that we interact with is think about the business. Think about the things that actually threaten revenue. What are the things that actually threaten reputation? What are the things that actually threaten uptime? And then backfill with the more operational technical things. So as soon as they start speaking that business vocabulary, like how do we stay in business, not just how do we address this point in time vulnerability, the dialogue and the conversation shifts. And that's one of those where you see that evolution over time where, you've got the technical CISO, the compliance CISO, and the business CISO, those personas. And, those are absolutes on purpose, right? But the spectrum starts to blend. Once you take a technical CISO and they understand that they can use compliance to get what they want done, and they can speak the language of the business, they are suddenly a lot more powerful in that board meeting. And so helping them understand if the board is focused on, shareholder value or revenue or uptime, but you're super concerned with these point in time vulnerabilities or these 0 days or these things that are happening in the news, how do you translate that and meet in the middle? And so back to the whole My Cyber Scorecard and how you do that, the best practice frameworks don't change. The threat landscape constantly changes. And so being able to demonstrate that where it's, point in time, but also that constant analysis is what we can help shape for an organization. And a lot of times I use the analogy, you don't look at your bank account once a year. It's the same thing. You shouldn't look at your risk assessment once a year. It's a continuous thing that you have to deal with. And so that's the same thing from a reporting standpoint. If you don't have a plan of action and milestones or a risk register that you're constantly working and reprioritizing based on the evolving landscape, you're missing an opportunity. And so, it's not just about tools. It's not just about headcount. It's about, can you demonstrate that you are improving and sustaining your security program over time?
Awesome. So let me do a little bit of role playing here. So I'm a virtual CISO for a client. I'm one of the Pondurance virtual CISOs. I've been asked to come in by the CIO or the VP of IT, to present to the board why we need to invest in certain things. Okay. So with that setup, Neelu, we just pitched that to you. Dustin, added a bunch of stuff to what would the questions be associated with this?
I mean, so putting on a board hat, what I would want to understand is what's the program and how does this fit into the program? And how does the program achieve the objectives we've set from a risk perspective, right? So one-off purchases, I'm going to be a lot less interested in. What I'm really interested in is, okay, so we are in this kind of industry. Here is the most basic acceptable risk level. Here's the risk we're willing to take. Here's the risk that we want to close the gap against. And here's how our architecture needs to evolve in order to meet that risk framework. Now, it may be the case, by the way, in the board conversation where you go, hey, wait a minute, but I don't think we're willing to take this particular risk that you just said we're okay taking. So what would it take to close that gap? And that's really the conversation you want to have is, here's the risk level that we're agreeing to, both as a management team as well as from a governance oversight structure. Here's the program that gets us to a place where we have a high level of confidence that we're going to be able to maintain that kind of risk profile. Are we all agreed on that? Because when this other risk hits that we've agreed we're not going to resource, we need to be okay with the ramifications of it. So the board conversation needs to be pretty strategic. To be honest, most boards don't actually care about the specific subsegment of cyber product that we're looking to deploy, or who exactly we're looking, which vendor we're going to buy it from. We want to understand it at that bigger level. And this is the essence of the gap of grief, right? The gap of grief is the fact that most cyber professionals live in this very technical space. And we've had to for 30, 40 years, ever since the internet was invented and the Morris worm kind of took a whole bunch of computers down. Executives and boards live at a completely different, in a different place, and they're thinking about things from a strategic level. And the gap between those two conversations, between those two ways of thinking, is what we call the gap of grief and what we're trying to close here. So, that would be my approach. I would hope that the CISO could speak at that strategic level to the board, as well as at a highly technical level to the business unit owners and the security practitioners, to get the program in place that's the right one for the company.
Okay, so I'm going to throw one more scenario at you, a little less on the technical side, but still, an operational focus versus, a strategic focus, is most organizations can't support a 24/7 shop. Being able to have a in-house SOC, is really not affordable to anybody but the largest companies, and even those have found that that's probably not a viable approach. And so, obviously an ROI on anything is hard to measure, and I'll go back to that question in a minute. But when it comes to alternative costs of an MDR provider as compared to building it in-house, those are significant expenses to buy a SIM, to build a team, to retain the team, to have an IR capability, all of those types of things. And so is it fair to say that from a CISO perspective, if they took a new job into a company, or a new CIO took a job in a company, that coming to the board and saying, a risk area that we're not willing to accept, we believe would be 24/7 monitoring of our infrastructure and our capabilities, and associated with building that infrastructure out, is definitely not viable from a financial. Therefore, going with an MDR is ultimately the way that we're going to approach. Any comments or questions? Dustin, you want to start it off as the virtual CISO, adding to that comment the CIO just made?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we focus on helping organizations understand total cost of ownership over time. And then also reminding organizations the talent gap is huge, and their ability to keep resources is a lot different than a third-party provider like Pondurance. So, we always joke, our people don't get sick or take vacation, or at least you'll never know, right? Because we have the staff, we've got the depth and bench backed by the power of Pondurance. We've got that subject matter expertise that you can't hire other than through a third-party provider. And so that's the other thing where, if you've got a SOC at one network, they see one network, where we see hundreds. And so being able to take that visibility and apply those best practices, those trends and baselines to their environment is a lot more valuable than them being able to hire it. And it's generally less expensive.
Anything to add, Neela?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, right? You're getting an improved security posture that's leveraged and run by folks who, as Dustin said, are looking at hundreds, if not thousands, of networks and seeing the trend lines. So for most companies, maintaining a 24/7 SOC is simply not possible. As Dustin said, between the technology required, between staying on top of every threat and the talent requirement, which is getting harder every day, it's not possible. And by the way, there's a lot of companies that have a 24/7 SOC for some of their operations, but they will use an outsourced provider like Pondurance for another set of their another parts of their organization because it's the most appropriate thing to do. So it's a win-win all around because it's not having that kind of visibility into what's going on in your architecture is no longer acceptable because of the harm that can come no matter how big or small the organization is. And the reality is that for most folks, it's simply not possible to build your own SOC. But getting a service like Pondurance gives you that same capability and risk mitigation strategy on an outsource and leverage basis.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I believe in this marketplace more than, the average person. I've done the same, business model 6 times over now. And, I think the need today is bigger than it's ever been before. And so, so it's really being able to arm people with, how do you justify this to businesses? Because surprisingly, there are still many, many companies that have no outsourced security that have no chance of ever building an internal security, capability either. And so let's go back to I triggered the word ROI, which the industry has evolved to at least recognize TCO. And so return on investment is a hard element within security because it's implying that you're going to get some particular positive return for an investment. Most people have now moved to total cost of ownership. So how much is this really going to cost me? And how does it reduce my risk overall? And so let's talk about that a little bit relative to, cyber risk reduction, talking about it at a board level, talking about it in being able to present that on a continuous basis, that the investments you're making are showing a positive return in the scheme of reducing risk. Dustin, you want to start off, or actually let's have Neelu start off.
Well, here's the thing. Can you afford not to have locks on the front door? Okay, that's one set of businesses. Can you afford not to have an alarm system? Different set of businesses. Can you afford not to have a security guard in the lobby? Different set of businesses. Can you afford not to have key card entry into your office space? Different set of businesses. How do you show an ROI on that? Right? You understand, we've gotten to a place where we understand physical risk really well, and we're not demanding an ROI for every security investment you're making to make sure people can't walk into a building and walk into the office and walk away with your equipment or with your IP. We're at that place with cyber where it's not a question of, are you going to put locks on the front door? It's a question of, do you need locks, an alarm system, a security guard, a key card entry? Like, how much of that security architecture do you need to have in place? Some of it is about what can you afford to do, but a huge part of it is what risk are you willing to take? And we need to be able to talk about those risks in a similar way.
Yeah, I think it's important, especially that, put it in that context, but also thinking about, the lack of evidence isn't evidence, right? So we always talk about assume breach, assume you are breached. And so you need to have those additional eyes because, dwell time, yes, it's shrinking, but only because organizations are implementing solutions like Pondurance to actually have that visibility into the network. And so that's an important caveat to where, what are you okay with? So back to that whole risk tolerance concept. And then some of the things from a ROI standpoint, I've seen a shift with some of our clients on time saving, being able to quantify lack of downtime, right? So they're, doing a different math model on it. But then also you think about from an operational standpoint, what are their teams capable of getting done now that they're not doing the security function? So I think everybody's evolving to kind of look at it, you use risk, right, as the first point, but then look at these added benefits from a time saving standpoint, and then the lack of downtime, the lack of needing to train and hire and keep and retain this type of talent that is completely necessary. So it's not, we can avoid it. It's, yeah, we need it, but can we get it quicker and easier through a third party provider like Pondurance?
Yeah, I
Understanding
think
everyone is a target, right? And that's the piece that has really changed over the last 5 years, is every single company and even individuals are a target right now. So you can't, have a blind eye toward this risk.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for a lot of executives and people that don't live cybersecurity every day is they will hear things like, we've got to do multi-factor authentication. Legit reasons, obviously compliance is one, getting cyber insurance is one, best practices in general. But then they'll see 97% of all the IR cases that we take in our IR environment have multi-factor authentication that got bypassed, either through session hijacking or, some type of brute force, multi-factor authentication approach. And so, I think part of this is also educating on a continual basis when those types of events, that type of data come out, to be able to really take that data and put it in the context of your business as well. So yes, that is true, but 100% of all companies that don't have multi-factor authentication are probably going to be compromised as well. So you're looking at, an order of magnitude in those scenarios of, if you don't invest anything, nothing is guaranteed. But I guarantee, again, that the less you invest in particular areas, the less you prioritize, the more probable that your negative impact is going to be. And so if you think about, and we have a IR team, we do, hundreds, actually approaching thousands of cases a year on our IR side, coming from cyber insurance. And so one of the things I know, Dustin, we've been doing is taking the cyber insurance requirements around ransomware, BECs, and really educating the marketplace on what they need to be able to do to make those minimal standards, but actually exceed those standards. And so where are you guys seeing, a best practice evolution, working from a top-down scenario relative to the marketplace as a whole?
Yeah, I think one thing to think about is that concept of defense in depth, and that it's not static, it's dynamic. So it changes based on the threat landscape. So business email compromise and ransomware, you add on something like Pondurance, the managed detection response. But if you didn't scope it to where we're also evaluating where you're getting hit or breached, then that's a gap in visibility that we need to work with our clients on, and clients need to understand. If you're going to have a third party in your house protecting you, you need to give them the keys to the full place. And so that visibility from an email standpoint where BEC is all over the place, if we're not receiving those logs or those events to proactively alert, hey, something's happening, impossible travel or something else with credentials, then there's a gap in your coverage. And so I think organizations understanding we need to build from a defense in depth standpoint based on what we know is necessary, but make sure that we understand everything needs to be in scope. And we need to have that visibility across the board and constantly validate that visibility with our provider. And so understand Pondurance as an extension of their team, we need to have that same access to the information where it's important.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is obviously the underlying product providers, or service providers in many cases, are changing their environment so rapidly that you've got to really have a great program around understanding what those changes are, how they impact everything, communicating to clients, because a lot of the changes have to happen on the customer side, not just the vendor side of the house from a security perspective. So
Yeah.
if you think about where we are in the marketplace today, and you had to make a couple recommendations for a CIO that also owns the responsibility of security, or, a CISO or a VP of security or somebody of that sort that ultimately, has just stepped into the job. Like, what would your first thing as you're meeting with them as a board member for the first time, you're going to give them some situational analysis of, what you've seen and different things. But like, what would your recommendation be to this person that's just stepped into the job and they're like, oh God, I don't know what I don't know yet. Like, how do I, communicate anything to the board relative to what I'm going to do, get information from them that can help me? Like, what's your
I
recommendation?
would tell them to hire Pondurance. Um, no, but seriously, I think what's really important is you need to figure out who's going to be supporting you on that security journey, from understanding your starting point to helping you get to, helping you close the gaps that need to be closed, helping you communicate with all the constituents you need to be communicating with about what your program is, what success looks like, what the metrics and milestones ought to be, and then actually measuring and putting out the reports that help you report on those metrics and milestones. So this isn't an individual sport. This is a team sport. And you want to make sure you have the right team. And that's really the most important part. And you need to make sure it's, like I said, it's someone who's there, who has your back and is there to understand what your needs are and help you get to the place that you need to get. So, and this is where, from my perspective, and why I'm so excited to be a part of Pondurance, Pondurance provides a very unique set of capabilities, from my cyber scorecard, which just doesn't exist anywhere else, the virtual CISOs, to actually the MDR capabilities. What I'm proud of is that this is a team that works hard to be the right partner to CISOs and CISOs. And whether it's Pondurance or not, that's what this person needs.
Dustin?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we get this scenario quite often. So new CISO in seat, they say, I've worked with Pondurance in the past, I need help. The thing that we always do from a methodology standpoint on cyber advisory is get as knowledgeable about the organization as possible as quickly as we can. And that's the same thing that we coach new CISOs to do also. So look at policies and procedures, look at network diagrams, look at asset inventories, look at the outputs of last vuln scans, pen tests. That gives you a pretty good idea of where you're at, and you can do that very, very quickly. Then the idea is, where do you need to go next? So what is that driving factor? Do you need to hit some compliance milestone? Do you need to do something for cyber insurance? So you've got kind of that plan of attack. So you know where you're at, you know where you need to go. But then along the way, it's what are the things that you should be doing also is where we add a lot of value. And so, a lot of times there's gaps in policies. They're not written in a usable manner. They're just kind of shelfware. They're not great. We help organizations revamp those, make them usable and real. And then also from kind of the deep look at where are you from an actual protection standpoint. Let's make sure we're leveraging the tools that you already have, make it make sense. And then, of course, if there's an opportunity where Pondurance can do more of the heavy lifting, I mean, that's, all roads lead to MDR for us. We want managed detection and response, and every single client we have, it is the best protection day in, day out from an operational security standpoint. And so, yes, we want that everywhere. But knowing where the organization is, where they're starting, and where they want to go is where we try to fit in.
Yeah, and I had the experience of having the CISO report to me on an organization we were spinning out of a larger company. And so we had to build a security infrastructure program, everything from scratch. And so what I said to the team was, look, we're stepping into this new situation, whether it's a new CISO role, a new, spinoff of a company, new whatever. Some transactional thing happened that gave us a starting point. We have 3 to 6 months, maybe 12, to tell everybody what the gaps are. This is our thing after 6 to 12 months. And the more gaps that we can identify and the more we can measure what that risk is. And of course, at the top of that, what do we have to do for regulatory compliance is going to be first, because everybody understands that gap. And then operationally, how do we support even regulatory compliance? Because everybody's got PII laws in their states. Everybody's got, some regulation that ultimately they roll into these days. And how do we close those gaps? Not just on the, you got to have multi-factor authentication, you got to have SIM, you got to have all this other stuff, MFA, whatever. You've got to really translate those into the breach spec. What are the consequences if we don't have the capability to respond and do a full detection within 72 hours? What are the capabilities that we're going to have to alert all of our customers on, our investors on, all these scenarios that ultimately we've got to have that infrastructure in place. And my gut is most organizations can't do that in-house within that period of time. Bringing in a third party, whether Pondurance or another third party, to really close down onto that gap. And we all know that it doesn't matter the consulting firm, like having a consulting firm say the same thing as you, or just give you a good gap analysis. It is measurably better than the in-house team arguably saying that, because it endorses it, or it actually quantifies that that's true what they're saying. And so my biggest thing is like figure out what those gaps are quick, identify what those are going to cost to close those gaps. Are they measurable things that people can make a decision on? Like, yes, I'm willing to take that risk, or it's prioritized as number two, because you're probably not going to be able to close all the measurable risk within a 12-month period, but putting everybody on notice that exists so that ultimately they know you're going to need to close it. Now, the other scenario is a CISO that you walk in as a existing organization, and then it's a reverse. What are all the gaps we have that are debts that the company have not paid? And most business people understand the concept of debt. We pushed out all these things that were never done, either because they were never notified, they were too expensive at the time, whatever they were. But ultimately, there are these things we have to do just to run the business at the bare minimum.
Yeah, that's one of the things with my cyber scorecard that we focused on, the ability to see that journey. That's not just an annual point in time. So you do that analysis, risk assessment, gap analysis, anything where you dig in, understand where those gaps are. You've got a baseline. And then as you work your plan of action and milestone, you look at the critical things that you need to focus on, but also low-hanging fruit, right? So that's one of the things that Pondurance is very good at. Let's put together a project plan to address these things in a way that makes sense for the organization. And then let's update this as quickly as we possibly can. So we've got that trend analysis over time. Plus, we're doing something interesting called near neighbors, where if you're in an industry and of a certain size, what do they look like from the risk profile standpoint? And so, if you're lagging in certain areas, that it makes sense because your near neighbors are focusing on that. You run the risk of not doing something if you're on par and you should actually address something, but we, deal with that differently. But the whole concept with the My Cyber Scorecard remediation plan is that you are addressing risks. That's the real value of any assessment. Identify and address, not just being knowledgeable of those risks.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add to that, the competitive landscape often prevents executives from sharing a lot of information back and forth. But when you get to a security level, peer groups within your own community seem to be much more willing to share, because ultimately understanding what your near neighbors are doing, provides benefit to everybody in the industry as a whole, and the business community from a resilience perspective as well. So, Dustin, thanks very much, not only for doing this video, but also for what you do for Pondurance every day, and protecting our infrastructure and capabilities in-house. Like I've told you many times, I applaud you and the team, because I do feel that we have the best security program of, again, don't want to make it sound negative for anybody else, but many companies that I have worked for.
Target on our backs,
yeah,
Doug.
Exactly. And then number two, Nilu, thank you very much as always for being a partner in the business, and for your expertise that you bring to the table and giving us a different perspective that we often don't have the luxury of as well. So with that, we covered a lot of topics. Hopefully I can convince these guys and others to come back and do this over and over again. So if you have more questions that you would like us to cover, that would be awesome. If you could give us that feedback. And if you have questions about Pondurance, please go to pondurance.com and take a look around at what we do every day. And look for our other webinars and our other topic areas that we present on a regular basis. Hope to see you guys in the field. Thanks very much.